Do you hear that message from Greg Hunt? Is it in line with the thinking in New South Wales?
Yeah, of course it's in line, Laura. It's two separate messages. There's one about social distancing and and making sure people abide by the rules, and that's why over the Easter we had a very strong message about people travelling and spreading. We're seeing the numbers come down. We're seeing the downward pressure on the curve as we all had set out to achieve. And then now we're also talking about what does the bridge or what does the road on the way out in recovery look like. And that's why a couple of weeks ago the Premier indicated that because of the fantastic results, the downward pressure on the spread, that we could start considering a range of lifting restrictions across the state. And that is something that's in line with what we're saying. But we're not saying anything about lessening social distancing rules. They have to apply, and they'll continue to apply for a long time.
Yeah, and this is where we need to be really clear. It's not confusing at all. We're hearing that social distancing needs to remain in place. We're also hearing that there needs to be some cases of isolation. We're seeing that with returned travellers in hotels, for example, or anyone with symptoms. Is that the antithesis to, or is that in line with perhaps loosening some of these restrictions on pubs and cafes in the weeks ahead, do you think?
Yeah, well, what the Premier indicated a couple of weeks ago is we'll be making some assessments, and we'll be working through Treasury, working with the health experts to identify risk versus, of course, benefit. And, you know, if there's an economic lift or a social or mental wellbeing lift versus the health risk, we have to take that into account. We have to start looking at where you possibly could lift restrictions, but not at the expense of the health expert advice, nor at the expense of lessening the message on social distancing.
Right, so we could go back to what we saw perhaps a month ago, where cafes were allowed to open, you were allowed to dine in restaurants, but there was still that social distancing rule that remained in place. Could we see that sooner rather than later, in your view?
Yeah, look, I think that there's a real chance that we'll look at all of those options. To single out the restaurants, pubs, or cafes as one. It could be a range of other industries and sectors. But as long as the social distancing rules are in place, that we are stopping the spread, all those measures, protocols are in the businesses, then of course that's where the next step, getting out of this crisis, will take us. But again, we'll rely on expert advice. That 4 square metre rule, the 1.5 metre distancing rule, they'll always apply. They'll apply here for a long time until there's a vaccine. But until then, there is an opportunity to lift restrictions as long as it's done in an appropriate way that actually measures the risk of infection, and that is what we as a state and all other states will be thinking through the same lens.
Now, anyone who's an NRL fan will know it is pretty hard to social distance when you are tackling. How do the rules then apply to a game being restarted or games being restarted at the end of May?
Yeah, and this is the big question. Just reminding everybody, the NRL chose to shut its own game down. There wasn't any public order on the NRL. It was in relation to the height of the pandemic, and therefore it made a decision for the well-being of its players, its fans, all the clubs as such. In the meantime, they've been working on how to kickstart the season again. Now, they've named a date in late May. That may be ambitious, it may not be, but whatever they choose to do, they will still have to go through the process and the protocols and measures to protect players, staff, and all those associated with the game in relation to the spread. Now, I haven't seen that. I've reached out to Peter V'landys and we'll be meeting up this week in relation to what does the plan look like. But, for all of us, I think there's, NRL, rugby league is part of the psyche, especially at a time that we're in isolation. There's nothing better than sometimes letting loose on the box and blaming the referees for the poor decision. But we have to give the NRL the opportunity to pitch, but they'll have to go through the health expert advice and how they will still stick to the social distancing rules. Remembering
how can they possibly do that, John Barilaro? How can they possibly stick to the 1.5 metre rule? It wouldn't be a game of rugby league if that was the case. So are you talking about special rules and special provisions for the NRL? Well,
no, because you've got to consider the NRL and a game of footy. It's the workplace for many of those athletes, those footy players. It's their workplace. So you've got to put in place those measures. It's also about making sure that the individuals are tested, the individuals are looked after. As I said, it is a tough call, but there isn't one that we should just put our head in the sand and say it's impossible. Let's allow the NRL to pitch the governments exactly what they have in mind.
Yes.
Now, Peter V'landys, what he was able to do with racing, he's done a really good job with racing to keep racing going. So let's have a look. Let's not dismiss it until we've seen it. It may not get up, but let's give it a go.
Absolutely not, and I don't want to dismiss it because I think at this point it's really important for people to look forward to something, and we are all talking about the NRL as the great signal of hope in the weeks to come. But
yeah.
I mean, what other workplaces don't have to adhere to that 1.5 metre rule? I can't think of any.
Well, we've got mining in a sense. So we've got mining construction sites where people are travelling in the same vehicle. There are provisions in the workplace to manage it. Look, a lot of our workplaces have fantastic OH&S rules in place. Our footy players are some of the healthiest athletes and healthiest people in society. And the reality is that they are looked after in a way that probably most of us don't, because they've got their own medics within each club. So there is a way forward if there's a protocol and a measure put in place. So I'm just reaching out to the NRL,
doesn't it? Because at the one hand, at the beginning of this interview, you said that social distancing will remain in place for the weeks and months to come. But if the NRL's to get up at the end of May, there would have to be special rules in place to allow the game, the players, to breach those social distancing rules. If they isolate in their homes or they keep the games to one area, there would still have to be special rules, wouldn't there?
Well, we would have to look at what the measures are. So let us. I'm not going to prejudge. Like I said, I'm catching up with the NRL this week.
But are you open to that?
And I'm happy to work with them.
I think we all want to see the games start up in a safe way that doesn't send the wrong message to the community. But can we sit here and now and say, well, there's going to have to be some provisions that are specific to the NRL?
It's specific to the NRL and could be specific to any other industry. As I said, we've got industry, construction, mining, all happening as we speak, and those measures are in place. So let's have a look at what they've got to offer, and then we'll make a decision. We're not going to risk the well-being and health of players. We're not going to risk the well-being and health of their families, and the chance that you could actually spread a virus beyond the family unit. So there's lots to talk about. I think it's okay to have a vision and a hope. It may not be May, it could be later, but let's try and work through this. If we can't, that is fair. But we are coming to a point in this crisis where we can make these sort of decisions.
One final question. Do you find it odd that Don Harwin lost his job for breaching the rules, but no one has lost their job over the Ruby Princess?
I think, look, Don Harwin stepped down. He stepped down in relation to a breach. He was fined, and that was the penalty that he received, like the same fine, the $1,000 fine that any other New South Wales citizen would receive if they breached the rules. But he chose then to step down on Saturday because he thought it brought pressure onto the government in relation to his issue, and that was his decision. To go beyond that, what's happening with Ruby Princess, there's a criminal investigation. Let's get to the bottom of that. There's no question, the Ruby Princess there are lots of questions that we'll have to answer, and in time we will.
18 deaths now linked to the Ruby Princess, and not one person has thought that they should lose their job over it. Doesn't that seem a glaring oversight?
Laura, as I said, that there is an investigation into the Ruby Princess, and let us get to the bottom of the facts. I know there's been lots said in the media, but we need to get to the bottom of the facts, and once we get that, and I have all the confidence in Commissioner Fuller and his team to bring transparency to this issue, because this is the number one issue that I think the Australian people, and especially New South Wales citizens, want answers on. When that comes about, then we'll respond.
Okay. Well, at the conclusion of this investigation, let's not preempt it, but people will need to lose their jobs over this, surely.
It's not for me to say. Let us have the investigation, and then we'll make those decisions.